Welcome back, everyone, to Fiber Festival 2020, Instability. We're in our fourth session now of the conference, our special hybrid COVID-proof conference. The fourth session is called Radical Streams. And in this panel, we'll be investigating material transformation in the age of planetary crisis. We'll explore the politics of resource making, logistics of resource extraction, and the narratives of landscape design, and how they all relate to each other. In what way can speculative design, cartography, art, and science fiction help to better grasp these radical streams? We're joined by three virtual panelists, and we're going to start off with Michaela Büsse, design researcher and editor of Migrant Journal. We're also presenting this whole panel in collaboration with Migrant Journal. Then we're going to hear from Anca, Benera, and Arnold Estefan, who are researchers using these methodologies to reveal invisible patterns. And finally, we'll conclude with Angela Chan, who runs the curatorial platform Worm. Welcome, everyone.
Welcome.
Maybe we want to hear, first from Michaela. It looks like you're on the beach, but where are you really, Michaela?
Well, I'm home in my kitchen, actually. The picture you can see behind me is a scene of a land reclamation in Penang in Malaysia. I'm going to talk a bit more about the land reclamation, so this is just like a...
Oh, fantastic. So your background is related to your talk. Great. Well, I'll hand it over directly to you then. You can start us off. Welcome. Mm-hmm. Are you going to share some slides or just talk?
I will share my presentation with you.
Great.
Michaela, maybe you can quickly introduce also your part of Migrant Journal, and we present this together. Maybe a few words on Migrant Journal?
Yes, I will say a few words about the collaboration. So Migrant Journal has been collaborating with Fiber, I guess, since almost 1.5 years by now. We've been part of the cartographies of the Vanishing Now research lab last year. And like the theme of the conference, Migrant Journal is very much interested in planetary entanglements and mostly related to the topic of migration. As the title of the magazine suggests, we have been over 3 years and 6 issues been tracing different forms of migration, trying to open up the notion of migration beyond the refugee narrative, but looking at material transformations of ideas, of animals, of seeds, of plants all around the world. Yes, and my talk will also relate a little bit to that approach that we've been following with Migrant Journal. However, I'm going to talk about my own research today, but I have been involved in curating this panel. Very happy to be here today.
Great, thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, if you would like to share your presentation with us.
I will. So you should be seeing my screen now. And with this, I start.
Yes.
The colonial port city of Malacca has seen a succession of occupations over the second half of the last millennium. Portuguese, Dutch, and British colonizers ruled over Malacca, a heritage that is not only present in the infrastructure of the city, for example, the Dutch Stadhuis, I hope I pronounced it correctly, or the Portuguese community square, but appropriated for opposing interests. In Malaysia's economic growth and urbanization strategy, Malacca was chosen as a site to be revived as a tourist destination. Being strategically located along the Strait of Malacca, it has played a century-long role in the trading of spices between Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. The glamour of the old days is long gone. With the growing significance of Singapore as the main trading hub in the region, Malacca's search for new markets focused on its cultural capital. After many failed attempts to situate Malacca as the cradle of Malay culture, an attempt connected to the fact that the Declaration of Independence was declared here, a specially assigned task force recommended to utilize its former cosmopolitan status and emphasize, I quote, the city's traffic with the world. As a result, Malacca, together with Georgetown, a former British outpost, received UNESCO heritage status in 2008. What unfolds is a twisted story combining the appropriation of heritage for both urban redevelopment and globalization efforts, as well as a means to resist. The silted grounds of Malacca act as a stage for diverging modes of being that bring about one another. Sand here can be seen as the unintended link between capital, human, and non-human existence. Attracted by the proposition to revive Malacca's vibrant past, several urban development projects have popped up that accommodate for the near future in which such a revival will bring millions of tourists and potential residents to visit. These projects are mostly backed by Chinese investors, based on an agreement between the Chinese and Malaysian government, according to which Malaysia will become one of the many nodes in the Belt and Road Initiative. The large-scale infrastructure project, which is facilitating the renewal of the former Silk Road, the trading route between East and Southeast Asia, Middle East, East Africa, and Southern Europe, aims to reassure Chinese presence in the Strait of Malacca. The so-called Malacca Dilemma describes the potential threat to China's oil supply, evoked by Singapore's naval power in the region. Currently, China is the world's largest importer of oil, with 80% of its supply having to cross the Strait of Malacca. But presence in Malacca is only one measure in China's diversification strategy, and arguably not the most promising one. In a parallel project, the east coast of Malaysia will be linked via train route to Port Klang near Kuala Lumpur, thus circumventing Singapore and a part of the strait, transporting oil from one coast to the other. Other alternatives currently investigated are pipelines through Thailand and Pakistan, preventing shipping through the strait altogether. While investment in Malacca hinges on the success or failure of alternative trading routes, the local government quickly jumped on the bandwagon to marry Chinese ambitions with Malacca's own heritage strategy. Together, the initiatives create an atmosphere that accommodates for and further fuels speculative urbanism. Speculative here does not only refer to the projective nature of these developments, but the fact that they financialize on a future vision that does not necessarily ever have to become manifest. What this means becomes apparent through the many half-finished and abandoned reclamation projects spread along the coast of Malacca. My first visit takes me to Gateway Malacca, the signature project of both Malacca and the BRI in Malaysia. Projected to be finalized by 2025, it consists of 3 artificial islands, housing residential and tourist facilities, an international cruise terminal, and a deep-sea port. It is supposed to stretch 1,366 acres and bring an additional 2 million annual tourists to Malacca. Yet, with the unexpected change of the Malay government in 2018, several investors have dropped out and the project came to a halt. Furthermore, the East Coast Rail Link, which was initiated in 2017 and shortly after Gateway Malacca was launched, drew more attention and money away. The bridge that connects the mainland to the island is neither frequented by cars nor by any passengers. The only people who work on the island are security guards who protect the entrance to empty slots of land or half-built houses, ruins with no history. On my request to enter one of these sites, the guard is almost apologetic, as if he does not see any reason for why he should protect the site at all. One of the buildings that appear to be finished is located just next to the entry point of the island and facing the mainland. According to the geotags on Google Maps, the Riviera Malacca is supposed to house restaurants, cafes, and even a hotel, but it's completely empty, doors are closed, and windows are dusty from dirt and sand blown away. Through one of the dirty shop windows, I can see a small architectural model of the complex. It looks exactly like the building I'm standing in front of. Both seem displaced, lifeless, eerie. The tiny model behind the dusty glass can be easily discarded. But the big one is a silent vigil of a promise that was never fulfilled. To encounter them together, one nested in the other, highlights the difference of 2 modes of speculation. The architectural model, as the allegedly naive artifact, detached from place and time, encloses its political function. It projects a vision that does not have a place, but rather aims to create place via its vision. The building, designed after the model, eventually has to face its context, which is irreversibly altered by its presence. The model behind the dusty glass is not affected by what is going on in its surrounding. The building, and by extension the whole island, are slowly decomposing, not only causing irritation and siltation, but foreclosing the disconnect between shiny visions of a globalized future and their material and social foundations. This impression is further supported by my visit to the sales gallery of KAJ Development, the developer behind Gateway Malacca. Upon entering the gallery, an assistant comes rushing from some room in the back to show me the model version of the project. She seems not to have expected anyone to show up, so only upon my arrival she turns on the colorful lights that illuminate the model. Then she starts explaining the plans for the next 3 islands, the port, cruise ship terminal, malls, and that KAJ are currently in conversation with several investors. In light of the scenery outside, it seems hard to imagine why anyone would invest in a project that is so obviously a fail. Yet the notion of failure is something I came to rethink after several days spent in Malacca. The ghost town that is Malacca Gateway is not the only half-finished abandoned reclamation site in Malacca. In fact, the announcement of the BRI plans brought with it all kind of development initiated between Chinese and the local governments. On the Chinese side, such an engagement is financially supported by the government, eager to extend China's influence in Southeast Asia. On the Malaysian side, the city tries to leverage its recent UNESCO heritage status and fill its promise with some flagship projects. The space of the speculative is instructive here, incentivizing investments that pay off by further fueling the speculation, a bubble that might eventually burst. On the other end of the 10-kilometer-long reclaimed coastline, one can find the site with the promising name Malacca Sand Dunes. It is not part of any official tourist guide, since it's a rather accidental addition to the leisure landscape. Trending on Instagram and several travel blogs, it is handled as an insider recommendation, a place to stroll and take pictures. What is described as dunes here are in fact the heaps of sand that occur when trucks unload their load on a reclamation site before bulldozers distribute it and flatten the surface. Today, the site is overgrown by plants, and in close reach, several dredging boats are parked, some of them stranded, rusty. Puddles have formed between some of the heaps, resembling tiny mountain lakes. The spot feels slightly displaced. Despite its seemingly organic form, it is obvious that the dunes could not have formed here naturally. In Malacca, there is no attempt to make things appear natural. While in Singapore, trees are planted on high-rises and promoted for making the cityscape more livable, the dunes stand in for a lack of control over the material that is nature. In this regard, it is almost a radical statement to leave things half-finished and have the site reclaimed back or appropriated, depending on the point of view, by the wilderness of tides and wind. It thus appears almost plot-like that the dunes also serve as a backdrop for photo shootings by tourists and visitors, indirectly adding value to Malacca as a travel destination. Despite its intentional purpose and its accidental repurposing, the official narrative keeps emphasizing the future potential of the site to be occupied by development. As Martin Teixeira, spokesperson of the Portuguese community in Malacca, tells me, all ongoing reclamation is seen as some sort of a land bank that can be quickly activated if needed. His community, which is the last remaining community of Portuguese descent in whole Southeast Asia, up until recently has relied on fishery as a source of income, and more importantly, as a way of being. The prime site they inhabit used to face the ocean, and several restaurants would serve Portuguese-style fish dishes, freshly caught only hours before. With the reclamation of Gateway Malacca, Not only did their sea view vanish, but siltation turned the thin strip of ocean between the coast and the island into a stinky field of mud. I met him at the community center, which is as deserted as most of Malacca. The restaurants and hotels are empty. Humming caused by the air condition of the close-by Hilton Hotel fills the air. The boats of the fishermen lie stranded on the mud next to the community square. The locals are in despair because of the loss of the sea, which for them is tantamount to the loss of identity. Fishermen, I learned not only from him, but on several other occasions during my trip, strongly identify with their work, not as an occupation, but a way of being. Not being able to go out to the sea anymore, being deprived of the sea view is something that development cannot outweigh, if they are at all to benefit from it. Yet, as my conversation with Cesera made me realize, addressing them as victims with no agency does not reflect the complex interplay of life worlds. In fact, in Malacca, the Portuguese community held an asset that was only revealed and leveraged through the threat Gateway Malacca caused to them. Being the last of their kind, the heritage strategy of the city allowed them to make use of their special status and receive recognition and backing from the national government. Their holiday, Festa de San Pedro, named after St. Peter, the patron of fishermen and seafarers, turned into a tourist magnet. Unfortunately, this won't bring back the sea, but the homestay business became a new and lucrative leg for the community. The Portuguese community today holds a special mention with the UNESCO and is one of the must-sees in any guide to Malacca. Based on the local initiative, Malacca has recently renewed their Twin City Agreement with Lisbon, thus further strengthening international relations and promoting Malaysia as a travel destination for Portuguese tourists. The unique proposition was subsequently introduced into the promotional material for Gateway Malacca, emphasizing once more the cosmopolitan status of the former colonial port city. If one is to search for signs of hope, paying close attention is essential. Too easily does the massiveness of reclamation and development projects swallow up sand, people, and histories. When I passed by Gateway Malacca a second time, and after Teixeira has made me aware of the siltation and drainage problems caused by the project, I could not help but smell the foul air. On the first side, I noticed the grayish mud stretching about 200 to 300 meters all the way from the coastline to the island. It appears to be a homogeneous mass, disrupted only by puddles of water and occasional vegetation. But on closer look, I realized that the ground is in fact vibrant, populated by hundreds and thousands of crawling little creatures. Half fish, half lizard, mudfish are barely visible because they have the same beige grayish color than the mud they dwell on and in. They move very slowly, sometimes not at all, and one is required to stop, get used to the smell, and then patiently wait to be able to separate them from the background. These fish, it turns out, can exist without water for several months and instead use their skin to breathe oxygen. When it's getting too dry, they just dig deep into the muddy grounds, waiting for wetter days to come. Their hybrid state of being seems to be made for this environment, an accidental side product of an apparently failed reclamation project. And while the surrounding construction sites are abandoned and lifeless, the mudfish seem to flourish in their habitat. It is a calming, almost peaceful scenery amidst the surreal landscape. And while watching the mudfish for several minutes, it occurred to me that Malacca had productively confused my perspective. Here, where seemingly everything went wrong, where reclamation is a means in itself rather than a means to an end, openings occurred where I did not expect them. While the future of Malacca seems to depend on whether or not Chinese interest in the location returns, another potential future emerges from the wounds of the reclamation project. Siltation has forced and enabled the Portuguese community to speak up, claim their piece of the pie, even if it meant to accept that their way of life will be a different one. How Malacca will handle its muddy coast if the tourists eventually come in flocks remains to be seen. Like the sand dunes, the mudfish might become another curiosity, and the construction ruins a playground for adults. But in the temporary opening caused by the stagnation of reclamation works, the changing political climate initiated by the sudden return of the old government, and China further diversifying solutions to its Malacca problem, the mudfish are a reminder that something always evades the totalizing narrative. And it is in this certainty that there lies hope to keep thinking that things could also be otherwise. Arturo Escobar, in his groundbreaking contribution, Designs for the Pluriverse, came to describe autonomous design as a design practice with communities that has the goal of contributing to their realization as the kind of entities they are. Based on accounts from Latin America, more specifically the Cauca Valley region in Colombia, his project is based on the occupation of local life worlds by extractivism and globalization efforts. This ontological occupation, he argues, can be redirected and positively reappropriated through the establishment of alternative forms of organization that are non-capitalist and non-extractivist. Escobar's contribution is aimed at diversifying design scope and challenging both its entanglement with and origin in Western thinking and doing. Despite its ongoing epistemological violence, he wonders if, and based on community-led governance, another form of design can be made productive. Yet, autonomous design, in his definition, is set up in antagonism to design with capital D, as that which is universal, market-oriented, extractivist, and so on. It is only in resistance that autonomous design happens and is defined as such. There is no need to define the community activities as design, rather than the attempt to counter the idea of a mainstream design, eventually corrupting these very practices, as well as reifying the universal reading of design he aims to overcome. Much more fruitful is the notion of the pluriversal, as suggested in the title of his book. It does not insert a dualism in which both sides are always doomed to assert one another, but a much more dynamic configuration. My fieldwork in Malacca comes to describe the complex simultaneity of gain and loss, development and exploitation, human and non-human forces. I would like to deviate from describing only the reclamation and development projects as design process, and by extension, losses or resistance that occur as a causality of that design. Neither do I want to situate the sand dunes, mudfish, and the Portuguese community solely in resistance to Gateway Malacca. Instead, I would like to include the contingent, constructed, and transformable nature of all ways of living into my reading of design. Design, then, is not universal and one-directionally, but already always includes a manifold of social and material processes that come to manifest in particular constellations, but are not bound to them. Following Escobar's inspirational work, it is thus rather design's autonomy that is at stake. While it is on the one hand of fundamental importance to untangle design's politics, that is its implication with extractivism, it is through acknowledging that design is not only that, by which alternative understandings of design can emerge. Reducing design to being complicit, transformative, speculative, autonomous, or one of the many other terminologies which have emerged during the last decades, fails to recognize the simultaneity of these characteristics. To observe the tension they exist within and through, and the many ways they manifest in time and space, allows to gain a better understanding of design's movements. Design's autonomy is thus always a configuration of social and material processes, as much as it is instructive to these processes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great, thanks very much for your talk, Michaela. I wonder if you could expand a little bit. You talk about all of these diverse ways of defining design and how it shouldn't be confined maybe to any one such definition. And you use this great example of your field work to kind of illuminate some of this. maybe could you dive a little bit more into that? I mean, is there an interplay where the mode of design may shift from one to the other? Are they all happening simultaneously, in parallel, and sometimes merging? Maybe just unpick this a little bit for me and the audience here.
I guess what I'm aiming at is to show that there is, of course, an intentional part involved in design, but there is also a non-intentional part that can be an outcome, an accidental outcome, and that these processes are entangled, so that there is never full control over a design process and over its many stakeholders, be it human, non-human, material, right? But that design eventually is configured in an interplay between very, very different forces. So when we talk about design, we usually try to reduce the parameters, and we try to make a decision based on a very limited set of knowledge that we can achieve. And I guess I wanted to show that the design process can also go much further. And it's not only situated within the hands of the designer to a very much large extent. There is an intention, but to another extent, there is also a part that is affected by that, but that also evades the control of a design process.
Yes, exactly. And I think it might be also interesting to hear a little bit more when you spoke of the Portuguese community and noted that they shouldn't be thought of as victims without agency. Maybe this is something interesting to explore, this idea as well of agency of the people that are, we think of them as being subject to change, but of course they're participants in this change. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit more about that community in particular, or other examples?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's a complicated situation. Of course, you cannot generalize here. It's a very particular example. There might be other communities that are that maybe not have this unique position that this community has. But what I found interesting that it's exactly this coming together of the reclamation project, but also Malacca itself using the heritage status to promote itself as a travel destination. That these two things coincide with the Portuguese community being where they are, and gives them eventually the power to participate and to then also benefit from that. This is not necessarily something that you can find in other places in the same way, but I like to use it as an example to show that it's not only top down, nor is it only bottom up, but it's very much more complicated. And it's also not that those communities are necessarily against development per se. But yeah, so it's a bit of usually it's a bit of a black and white scenario when you talk about these processes. And I guess I wanted to unsettle that idea that it is so black and white, which does not mean that certain processes are not exploitative. It's just an attempt to also relate the unintentional and maybe also the non-human forces to these processes, to have us look at them differently and have us look at the complexities more, and not doom certain processes as capitalist, exploitative, and the others being left out of that. In fact, they are entangled and they build upon one another.
Yes, yeah. Do you think we could maybe talk a little bit about sand? Can we talk about the material and about what we might learn from, for example, planetary transformation just by following this tiny little material, these fragments of sand? It's kind of looking at the world, maybe pulling back, but then zooming in to this tiny actor.
Yeah, it's a fascinating material, and this part of the presentation that I shared with you now is only a fragment of the fieldwork I'm doing. I'm looking at sand because it's one of the most used so-called design materials around the world. We find sand in our infrastructures, in the roads, the buildings, the technology we use, and so on and so forth. So it's very much used for human purposes. And it's mostly used in land reclamation. So what I do is I look at sand's transformation from the mining site to then eventually the construction sites, and to look at the different processes and the different stakeholders that gather around this material and that also shape the way the material is used, but also to show how there is a limit to control over a material like sand, because sand naturally decomposes. It's not a stable material. So whenever you put it in place in form of an island, the natural forces will always work against you. And then sand also is a cultural medium. There are a lot of myths, a lot of narratives, a lot of hopes and desires attached to sand. And by focusing on that tiny material and then looking at the different scales of entanglement from the economic to the political, the social, the cultural, and how they shape the material and how the material shapes them in return, I think that is that's very fascinating and very insightful, because it both allows us to look at the way the social shapes the use of the material, but also how the material always counters certain economic or political processes. So it's neither that I want to put agency back to the material here, nor that I want to say it is only socially motivated, but again, show that it's somehow changing depending on the context, depending on the history, depending on the material itself, of course. So it's a bit of a countermeasure against the current tendency to understand design as that practice that negotiates between human and environment, but to look at the interplays between the three, how design makes this material in the first place, how it is then further appropriated, how it fights back, if you want to call it like that. And that you learn, I think, if you really look closely and if you travel with the material itself. And that's also something, if I want to talk a bit about MIGRANT Journal, that we've done very excessively during this years in the magazine, that we looked at particular materials, for example, lithium, and how they are loaded with certain cultural narratives, but also how they are also, of course, geologically bound. And there are very interesting intersections between those different scales.
Yeah, great. I think also to touch on something else that you're expressing concerns about extractive processes and things like that, and you can maybe correct my information here, but from what I understand as well, that we're running out of sand, the kind of sand that can be used for building material, and that people are stealing other people's sand. And I mean, this is something that blew my mind when I heard this. I mean, but I'm sure you know much more about it than me, and maybe can talk a little bit about how even something so common and simple as sand is becoming now this. It's becoming extracted at this alarming rate, actually, and causing severe problems.
Yeah, sand is a really contested material, especially in the context of Asia and also India. There is a huge black market involved in the trading of sand nowadays. One of the main sites I'm looking at is Singapore. It's the biggest sand importer in the world, and they have altered their landmass by just they reclaim 25% of their whole nation state over only 50 years. So sand is not renewable in that sense. It takes about 300 years for sand to actually, decompose from rocks and plants, and so it's a composite of different minerals. And yes, once you mine it and once you solidify it in particular infrastructures such as roads, for example, or glass or silicon, then you cannot really bring it back to its natural state anymore. And in those places where there's a high demand, Southeast Asia, for example, there is a lot of of these black market activities, because once sand is taken away, I mean, sand in the form of landmass, usually that's how it's mined. It's mined from rivers or from coasts. Then the coastline might erode. You know that, I guess, very well also in the Netherlands, which is also one of the countries that did a lot of land reclamation over many hundred years. And it does have ecological consequences. But then again, it is also a very political topic, because once sand is made into land, it starts to encroach on the sovereignty of the nation state. The borders become conflicted. So it's a very hot topic, and there have been many deaths, unfortunately, also related to mining or to journalists researching on the topic. You hear a lot about these things. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Unless there are any questions coming from the audience, I think we should perhaps move on. I don't see any hands popping up. So thank you, Michaela. That's really wonderful to give us insight into this area and what land reclamation is really all about. So thank you very much. And now we're going to switch to our next speakers, Anca, Benera, and Arnold, Estefan. And they're on over my right shoulder. Welcome to the room. Where are you broadcasting from today? Bucharest. Well, welcome. So I will let you introduce yourselves, maybe a little bit more about you and what you guys do, and then if you want to share your slides, also let us know when you're sharing them, and we'll confirm they're up on the screen here.
Good.
Yeah, maybe we will start by sharing the screen.
Yeah, let's start with this.
All right.
We are based in Bucharest. We have a research-based practice. Our practice investigates the invisible patterns that lie behind certain historical, social, or geopolitical narratives. We are interested in the phenomenon of man-made landscapes around the world, where the making and marking of landscape as a form of spatial modification goes hand in hand with heightened state violence and the overexploitation of resources. Under the current decline of natural ecosystems and environmental devastation, our research seeks to understand how the debris of the present and the traces of destruction are inherently intertwined with geographies of power and inequality on a global scale. This is a very brief introduction to our practice.
Yeah, in general, our subjects revolve around land use, the overexploitation of natural resources, and the military and the political impact on the environment. We analyze the system of debris that influenced and organized the world, and we call it the unnamed strait of the earth. We call it debris sphere. Maybe we can. Recently, we published.
Our screen is. Can you see the screen? Can you see our slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now a bit about the term, how we created this term. It links debris and sphere as contingent concepts and forms the space of articulation through which to consider what a natural landscape is, beyond what it looks like. Very early when we started to think about the landscape and how we can define it, of course, it's a very known book, Landscape and Power, by Nietzsche. And he proposes to transform the landscape from noun to verb. So not an object to be seen or text to be read, but as a process by which social and subjective identities are formed. And this is kind of this description or definition of landscape, let's say. And then the next term that inspired us to think about the sphere is the notion of made ground and subnature, architecture's other environments by an urbanist and architect, Arnold. And he speaks about the new urban nature produced by war, sort of spatial redistribution of violence. And he calls it the made ground, and gives the example of the wartime rubble in London East End, this one here, and flattened and grassed over to form future playing fields. Another example that he was mentioning was the geological novelty of the Schuttberg across Germany, Trümmerberg, like the Teufelsberg in Berlin. Although there are many similar man-made rubble hills in Germany, this is unique because the never completed Nazi technical college designed by Albert Speer is buried beneath. During the Cold War, the NSA built a spy listening station on top of the same hill. In the 1970s, the debris mountain became naturalized. Trees were planted as a beautification project. Today, the rubble is entirely covered by forest. This is a very known case. Maybe you know about it already. And then we thought that the main ground might be not only these beautified ruins of war covered by forest, but also the new geographical configurations formed by coral dredging in the British Indian Ocean territory, such as the Diego Garcia military base, or the Chinese military bases built on coral reefs in the South China Sea, or the extension of Johnston Atoll in the Pacific and the so-called blooming deserts of Israel where forests are planted. So we observe that all these cases have things in common in terms of how the land is occupied and how imagination of nature is used, either to camouflage or erase memory. In this way, history is rewritten through the manipulation of geology, scenery reconfigured according to the needs of strategic military thinking. There are many other examples around the world that share the same patterns. They are forming sort of strait of their own. This is how we imagine these layers within the larger lithosphere. Having said that, we name it debris sphere, the yet unnamed stratum of the Earth crust, formed by artificial hills, blooming deserts, military coral reefs, and other similar constructions, resulting from or still serving conflict and war around the world. This is sort of existing foundation for the project, which started in 2017. It is ongoing. When we structure it on theater of operation, like in the military: land, sea, ocean, air, space, and data. It is an umbrella concept for a series of other projects that we have been developing in the recent years. And we are going to show just a very few cases from the chapter Land.
Yeah, it's a series of art projects.
I'm not on. Am I on? I need to cut in for a second. Sorry. We're still on your first slide. We only see your first slide. Have you been advancing your slides?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Yeah. Now we see it. Because you're talking about, we're going to see things. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page. All right, great. Sorry for the interruption.
Have you seen this before?
No.
No, so this is when I was talking about the maid ground, the black horizontal hatchings here, the London East End. And then I was talking about in Berlin, this rubble hill. And then this is an image from the book that we published recently. This is Johnston Atoll in the Pacific. So this is our installation in Vienna, where we presented the project first time. It was a commissioned project.
And some details, but we can continue from now.
Yes,
okay, great.
Yeah, as we said, we will present some projects, some art projects related with this subject, debris sphere. This was the first setup or first iteration of this concept. Here we employ semi-scientific tools in order to imagine and map the debris sphere, including visualization of geological strata, architectural scale models, and a series of botanical illustrations in style of explorers. Atlases depicted trees, corals, and shellfish. Since 2017, the project examined the following instances. It's 5 case studies presented here in this configuration, which are only a small and yet incomplete sample of the worldwide phenomenon. Here we're showing these 5 case studies representing the coral reefs in South China Sea. The Diego Garcia Atoll is actually a secret US military base, meanwhile declared marine protected area, or the Johnston Atoll, a former nuclear test site, and of course the newly covered by forest, the artificial debris hills in Germany, and the latest one, the Jewish National Fund afforestation campaign in the Negev Desert, together with the Ariel Sharon Park near Tel Aviv. Here you can see the Teufelsberg representation is inside the installation. this is the
Diego
Diego Garcia details around the military infrastructure and some drawings related with these topics.
The nature that covers actually these sites.
Yeah.
The forest.
And yeah, we create a kind of imaginary botanical atlas where the local flora and fauna are classified with names that index the military site or operation. Instead of Latin names, we use, for example, the name of the militarized island or operation. Those drawings also are impossible to dissociate link between the elements of nature and their use for violence and irregular. This was the wall setup for the drawings.
And then we speak a bit about we choose just one case, the South China Sea, and this is an image, just an introduction from the BBC article that the world is running out of sand that you mentioned before, and we speak about China's new power to alter geography with sand. Actually, this is the Tian Kun Hao. I don't know if I pronounce correctly. It's the legendary. The name is a legendary enormous fish that can turn into a mythical bird, I guess. This is how it's described: the magical island maker. And this is the machine that is. It can dredge anything from sand and mud to coral. A lot of it cuts. Basically, it cuts material from the seabed. Then it sucks this sand, and then it conveys it as far as 15 kilometers from the ship, and it pile it up to form a new reclaimed land. It is interesting for us how that China has made the manipulation and movement of sand into a potent tool of statecraft, building a great wall of sand. It's called like that by the foreign media in the South China Sea. Its annual dredging capacity, the volume of sand that it can haul up from underwater, has more than tripled since 2000 to more than 1 billion cubic meters. The artificial island building activities in the South China Sea have caused devastating and long-lasting damage to the marine environment. It is the most rapid rate of permanent loss of coral reef in the area in human history. But even more disturbing than the new island's environmental impact are the geopolitical implications. China began building military bases on the sand-built islands, establishing de facto control on the area of the scrapfish and the paracels. But not only there, I think in Africa, they built recently a military base in Djibouti. We have more pictures of other case studies, and we frame them under the title "Landscape as an Extension of the Military Imagination." It's kind of subtitle. Other examples of military bases built by sand dredging or blasted coral reef for expansion of the island or used as paving aggregates. These are a few images from the book.
Yeah, and in the slide you can see some artificial islands in the making in the South China Sea, and still is ongoing process.
These are mediated images. Actually, these are satellite images, but provided by American newspapers. So we don't know really how they look like. It can be speculations. This is also.
Yeah, you cannot visit these sites.
Yeah, you cannot do proper research. Actually.
Okay, we can jump to the next project, maybe just to.
The next project is. In particular related to sand, because we analyzed particles of sand to reflect on land and history. While we did a residency in France, we came across a journal, the Sedimentary Record is called, and two American scientists analyzed the sand in Normandy after 1944. But they were not especially interested in the leftovers of war, but they were searching a totally different thing about the sand, and they found by chance that this sand conceals 4% of debris of bomb and metal fragments. They call it magnetic sand. from the D-Day landings, the battle that helped end the war and redraw the map of Europe. And this magnetic sand, along with other examples, are forming the layer of debris. Sometimes it's almost invisible, microscopic, like this one, or like the rubble hills that we mentioned before, which stands for a type of artificial terrain concealed by nature, as we said before. Almost invisible to the naked eye and placed under the lenses of the microscope, these tiny particles appear as landscape, like you see on the left in this image.
Yeah, each image representing only one small metallic particle, metallic sand from Normandy.
In 2018, in collaboration with a team of scientists in France, we analyzed the metallic particles, posing this question. Has this micro-ruin the potential to transform into a natural habitat in the future, or will just become archaeological remnants of a failed civilization? What kind of world can we imagine from the ruined present? And we take this magnetic sand as primary material for the installation, creating new narratives around the new living particles. And the result is a film, a video. Is this installation in the form of a laboratory?
Speculative. It's partly interactive with the public.
And we created, this is the laboratory table. In our video, the particles become actors. And actors like tools to manipulate after a predefined choreographic score. This is our score. So for instance, it's the minute 6.52 seconds, something happens, like in choreography, and they are moving according to this score, thus gradually becoming one living organism and a collective gathering, sort of nameless ensemble.
Yeah, this is the composition of the sand.
We were inspired actually by Crowds and Power by Elias Canetti, where he speaks about sand as a symbolic crowd. And we thought about this these are the actors inside the particles.
Yeah, because of the lack of time, we will jump for the next project, the last one, which is also connected strongly with sand. We call the desert rock that feeds the world. It's based on a story that Western Sahara Wall of Sand is the largest active military barrier in the world. The Western Sahara is a area designated by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory, contain a phosphate deposit of 1.7 billion tons. The Wall of Sand was built by Morocco to keep the Sahrawi people, the population living in the Eastern Sahara, away from the natural resources of phosphates in the region. Phosphate rocks are formed over millions of years in the earth crust. It is a finite resource and there is no way to manufacture it. It is one of the most important natural resources of the world, essential for plant and animal life. We create like a pendulum using one of these phosphate rocks from Morocco, hanging from the high ceiling. It is shifting and swing plane according to the rotation of the Earth. The pendulum is placed against the sand construction, basically a one-to-one section through the Sahara Wall of Sand.
And going back, we had some images from the conveyor belt where the phosphate is transporting to the. It's so big that so vast it's visible from the satellite.
Satellites.
This line.
It's connected the mining field with the harbor in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, then we go. We have some reflections on sand. As a kind of sort of conclusion. And we thought about presenting the face of the sand grain. We thought about this a lot recently. And just to think, as we speak, the moment, trillions of sand grains around the world move, taking another step on their endless journey. We perceive them as societies of sand grains, on the move in today's world, journeys that take place over great distances and long periods of time. As sand is carried along by rivers, waves, wind, and ice, each process imprints a different record, a texture on the surface of the grains. The physiognomy of every sand grain tells a story of its origins and travels. Every sand grain in the world is unique and individual. This is the face of the grain sand, like 0.5 millimeter. And families of sand grains from the same place,
Region.
yeah, from the same region, tends to show the same features, a sort of common genetic history, we noticed. And this enables another kind of detective work, the forensics of sand, which we are interested in at the moment, tracking down places and environments of origin. We like the fact that the sand is both minuscule and infinite, constantly migrates in a never-ending performance by virtue of its size, born to be transported by gravity, rivers, waves, ocean currents, and winds, shape-shifting into ever-changing landscapes. Over millions of years, sands are often buried under new layers of sediment, uplifted into new mountains, then eroded and transported once again. Each cycle of deposition, burial, uplift, and erosion renews the sand grains and rounds each grain a little more. The average time for this cycle is 200 million years. So when you walk on the beach, you should think about that. I think about that when I walk on sand. And we have another reflection, thinking about the future conditions of our planet, and that everything is deteriorating. And we think about life between sand grains and the microscopic spaces between sand grains that will provide safe havens for life, actually, because the extremophiles, such as Pyrococcus furiosus, can adapt very well. It thrives in boiling water, requires no oxygen, and incorporates the metal tungsten into its metabolism. It is also found in the deep sea vents, where the plates spreading apart produce superheat, toxic environments, and weird metabolism. It is not difficult to imagine Pyrococcus furiosus representing the last form of life on Earth, or thriving today deep in the sands of Mars.
And with this, we would like to close our short presentation.
If the war will end, there will be for sure life between the sand grains.
Yeah, this will be the world after us.
The world after us.
After we destroy our...
After humans will destroy everything, there will still be some life between the sand grains.
I think, yeah, that was the conclusion of our presentation.
Great. Thank you. It's rather nice to think that there would still be life in the sand, the deep vents. And also to refer to your other project, the project where you were collecting the sand from Normandy. That's also very interesting, as the sand is a kind of time capsule, which we don't really perhaps think about. What kind of future projects are you going to work on, maybe that will also reflect on other things that this material reveals, or can you talk about that?
Yeah, we are working on a project. We try to grow mycelium in sand, and we succeeded partially until now. We think about potential worlds that can feed from debris and from use sand as a source of, as a shelter.
So not like a hybrid organism, or more like a different kind of growth medium for the mycelium?
Yeah, we tried to create a hybrid organism, but it's not possible. Only an imaginary organism.
Yes.
We tried for months to use it, but in the end we noticed that it's only possible to use it as soil, let's say, more generally.
But yeah, we are working on an installation piece for a museum show, and we use this material, the sand from Normandy, as a primary material for our sculptural pieces, together with living organisms, like as Anca said, the mycelium. But of course, we add also some nutrients to create this habitat for for the mycelium to grow during the exhibition.
Yeah, we aim to grow our own materials, not to make works, but to grow works and to they are free to grow as they want.
Yeah, that's nice to think about the idea of maybe, yeah, instead of you create a finished product, the artwork has to form itself. You kind of guide it along a path, and then it finishes the process without you, in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see perhaps in that kind of mode also a role then for audience participation in terms of them to kind of also shape the ultimate end piece or end result?
Yeah, of course. They are. These recent projects are open to the audience to interact.
Yeah, because we use our works as a medium for information, and we would like to have the chance to experiment in different way, not only visually. Also, we recently also recorded the electrical pulse from the mushroom as a sound for our video piece. And I think...
Yeah, the bioelectrical field that the mushroom while growing.
And I think also the smell will be a component of the work, and partially will be also, you can physically interact with the piece.
Great. All right. Thanks very much. Now we're going to move on to our third and final speaker for this session, Angela Chan. Angela, where are you broadcasting from today?
I'm speaking from England.
England. Nice. You have a very pretty setup with your flowers. It's really, I want to compliment you on your setup. Everyone actually seems to have put some effort. It's really nice.
That's a new kind of new decorating, yeah.
It's our new form of decor, Zoom decor, we could call it, yes. Anyways, welcome Angela, welcome to the room. I'll let you get your presentation started, and you can just let us know when your slides are up, and then we will confirm they're there. And you're going to talk, you run the platform Worm, Art and Ecology, yes?
I do, yes, and that's one of the few things that I do, which I'll kind of give you a brief insight into as I speak. And let me know if my screen is shared okay.
Yes.
It looks good, yeah.
Super.
So please go ahead.
I'll begin. I'll say thank you firstly to Fiverr for inviting me to share some of my thoughts today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to talk a bit more with the rest of this session's guests as well. I'll firstly introduce to you a little about what I do. I'm a creative climate change communicator, which describes my range of projects focused on intersectional perspectives of climate change in historical and cultural contexts. I do this through curation, teaching, and public workshops as Worm, Art and Ecology, as well as science fiction research and coordinating the London Chinese Science Fiction Group, and also through my own art making practice, which is research-based with collective engagements. So with this brief talk, I'll lend to the radical stream through looking at the speculative climate narratives and how we map these by critically situating them within the realities of geopolitics that the other speakers have mentioned, and also climate emergency. I'll present on climate change and contemporary Chinese science fiction and speculative fiction, with an emphasis on the invisible, extractive, and uneven boundaries. Such boundaries complexly exist in our collective attempts to speculate fairer futures with those that climate change disproportionately affects, while simultaneously live in its urgent and uneven realities. So here are some of the 5 kind of areas that I'll introduce to you as an entry point to critically engage with speculative climate fiction from beyond our European borders. I'll define the boundaries that title my presentation. Then I'll briefly explain how it's necessary to understand how environmentalism works in China in order to better orientate our reading of Chinese climate and environmental SF. Here I'll highlight a few stories, and for this intro, they are by authors in mainland China, rather than other Chinese-speaking geographies such as Taiwan or Hong Kong, where my heritage is from. And if we're to hope for speculative fiction to culturally influence climate actions, we need to integrate the politics of global climate change to these narratives. Finally, I'll encourage how Chinese SF can sidestep some potentially difficult situations to reiterate the intersectional approach to global climate storytelling from one region to another. So, boundaries. I'm interested in analysing climate SF from mainland China through 3 types of boundaries: invisible, extractive, and uneven. And so firstly, with invisible boundaries, I'm referring to the metaphorical concepts of borders in the scholarship of SF, whereby the genre allows people to cross into the unknown. In particular, I reference the author and Chinese literature professor Xia Jia, who commented, the science fiction from non-English speaking countries, including Chinese science fiction, cannot be found in the history of SF. She remarks, in other words, Chinese science fiction is invisible, it's unseen and folded into the history of science fiction. And regarding extractive boundaries, these continue to expand in the real world as we read our stories. Through processes of destruction demanded by industrial petrocapitalism, they extract from the land, bodies, and other matter beyond material. Then these cause the uneven consequences of human and interspecies lived experiences. The exploitative processes disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, the working class, differently able-bodied people, our LGBTQIA+ communities, and further minoritized groups. The boundaries between ecological, socioeconomic, and humanitarian overlap as simultaneous crises. Therefore, we need our climate narratives to be steered by social and ecological justice, also known as climate justice. So in the second part, I'll give a very brief outline on China's domestic environmental affairs and how they are politically structured. Here on the slide, you can see the summary I wrote for a recent panel on climate and gender in China. It was co-organised by Young China Watchers for their environmental webinar series and by the Incredible New Voices, which is an international collective of self-identified women and non-binary creators and researchers working broadly on the subject of China. So here are the speakers, who are environmental journalist Carolyn Kan and Zhongxi Yu, who's a climate change activist and Chinese youth delegate for the 24th UNCCC. They established that organising in Chinese environmentalism is very different to that of other parts of the world. It is a top-down system whereby environmental organisations should operate as an extension of the government's policies. Both Caroline and Zhongxi discussed that more needs to be done to raise the cultural awareness of environmental and climate issues, and they suggest that these solutions might be in education, policy, and social media engagement, which can hopefully nurture and lead generative public discussions. And so that leads to Chinese climate and environmental SF, which has been increasingly kind of translated across the world and gaining a lot of traction in the recent years. And the topics that are to do with climate and environmental themes, such as include ocean plastic and e-pollution, urban waste management industries, and sea level rise. Whilst I don't really expect authors to be solely responsible in shifting climate politics, I do believe that their stories can nurture some of the cultural awareness towards public responses to these urgent issues. So my first section here looks at a few of my favourite climate and environmental SF by authors from mainland China. And in the past 18 months, we have been reading some of the following stories with the monthly reading group as part of our London Chinese science fiction group. And actually, since March this year, we've been video calling to discuss each month's story, along with the authors who are calling largely from China, and sometimes the translator who will be also crossing time zones, calling from Europe or North America. And this has been actually quite a lively and valuable chance for us to debate. Firstly, I'll introduce you to Folding Beijing by Hao Jingfan. It was written in 2012 and translated by Ken Liu in 2015. Her story is very well known, and as it won the 2016 Hugo Award for Best Novelette. And it is a social critique set in the near future Beijing. Here, the city has been reconstructed to geologically segregate its inhabitants into 3 locked social classes, such that they unevenly share hours on the Earth's surface on a rotational 48-hour period. The working class, largely labourers processing the city's waste, is the largest population and will never experience social mobility. The protagonist, working class Lo Dou, has a near impossible mission to deliver a message between the 2 upper classes. He finds himself existentially angered after accidentally winding up in a policy meeting to replace the livelihoods of the labourers while in preference for automated waste industries. I think it's a powerful story that holds realism at the core of its speculative environment, commenting on those compromised by so-called progress and reflecting on the widening wealth gaps as China develops to continues to develop. Next, we have The Story of Dou by Regina Canyu Wang, written by the author herself in English in 2019. It's a queer multi-species ecology SF and illustrates how an island, Dou means island in Chinese, first experiences and learns about climate change. They realize they must communicate a plan to all of the other species living on their back because they're an island, such as the ginkgo tree and various other animals, and does so through a cybernetic root system. Collectively, they work to mitigate the sand erosion by sea level rise. I invited the author to contribute this story in my recent exhibition, Climate Knowledges, at MAMA in Rotterdam. Regina collaborated with the musician Tessa Chu, who narrated the story as a sound piece. And here you can see it as part of the Climate Knowledges virtual exhibition. Next, we have Poems and Distant Lands by Gu Xi, written in 2019, and it deals with ocean plastic pollution. 2 innovators design a technology to recycle the unnatural marine materials. After failing to impress funders to ignite the project, their sample technology gives rise to biomimetic ecological systems underwater. It is an interesting read, especially as the author herself is an urban planner who speculates how the cities will face current challenges in the oncoming decades. She has mentioned to me that climate and environmental SF in China has grown to become quite interesting for writers like herself to explore due to the many depths that fictioning can allow. And then here is The Reincarnated Giant by Wang Jingcan, translated by Carlos Rojas. It tells of a wealthy old-aged man who pays for a procedure to be reborn as a baby with his adult brain in full function. His insatiable appetite exhausts the fictional nation's resources and labor until he's grown as big as a mountain and dies unable to hold his own weighted head because he's still a baby. It can be read to be a critique on how neoliberal unending consumption overlaps with patriarchal systems that exploit the Earth's resources for individualistic gains. The Reincarnated Giant is also a speculation into the complex biopolitics involving anti-aging technologies and legal selfhood. So all of my kind of like recommendations so far are short SF, and Waste Tide Here by Chen Chu Fan is actually a novel. It details the resistance by the labouring class of the fictional Silicon Isle, which is an e-waste landfill that's actually based on the real world's biggest e-waste landfill site, Guiyu, in Guangdong province in China. Aside from its tired trope of victimized young female protagonist Mimi, who becomes infected with a virus from the e-waste and turns into a cyborg, the novel does have an interesting depiction of international corporate relations that illustrate our complicity to the terrible working conditions of those barely surviving on the waste industry worldwide. So this leads me to my fourth part, where I'll look at the need to situate climate-related SF to the real challenges of today. And I kind of place emphasis on today, let alone tomorrow's issues. For example, Chinese state and commercial activities are creating uneven developments and socio-ecological degradation that impacts people in different geographies within and beyond its own. There are many complex threads we could analyse to examine how China's environmental footprint, both domestically and as an export to other countries in nations in Africa and Southeast Asia. And so I'll highlight only a few. So returning to Caroline and Zhongti, they pointed out that China's summer floods this year were not only widespread and disastrous, but also worst affected poorer rural areas where agriculture is the main land use, and impacting how the most socioeconomically disadvantaged will recover in the midst of a pandemic. After China banned the other countries, largely developed and from the West, from dumping the world's recyclable waste on its shores, this is now shipped to its neighbours in Southeast Asia, where actually the processing facilities and working conditions for labourers might be even less safe due to the perhaps less mature facilities. And here I choose a more obvious example that actually many SF stories across the world focus on: innovating and mass producing high-tech instruments. So China's push towards Industry 4.0 attempts to satisfy the developed world's insatiable demands for tech. With the iPhone, two of the world's most powerful companies, Apple and Foxconn, profit off exploited migrant labourers, many of whom face not only excessive overtime, hostility and violence on the factory floor, but workers' suicides are a common occurrence. This is sensitively documented in Dying for an iPhone by Chan, Selden and Nye. The book's research is as recent as the start of the COVID-19 lockdown, and I highly recommend it as a read. So I guess I would ask, what does it mean for Chinese SF to be gaining attention in the global science speculative fiction arena now? Perhaps it's a chance to narrate one's own story, to defy racial stereotypes and assumptions based on political conditioning. A couple of years ago, author and translator Ken Liu, who actually translates many of the short science fiction and novels from China, offered that readers should come to Chinese SF without the aim to find Chinese cultural characteristics, whatever you desire them to be. So he explains, when you go into space, you become part of this overall collective called humanity. You are no longer Chinese, American, Russian, or whatever. Your culture is left behind. However, I take the opportunity in this very moment and momentum of Chinese speculative fiction to actually problematize this. And so returning to Chinese and climate environmental discussions, where policies illustrate idyllic and natural landscapes of China, We can also find eco-nationalistic depictions of pristine plains in popular culture. But in examples like this, the recent live-action Mulan film, the ethnic majority in China, the Han, portrays defiant hegemony through scenes of beautiful landscapes. The realization that upon reading the film's rolling credits, only miles away from the filming location in Xinjiang are the mass detention and labor camps that has imprisoned Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims in what is known by international human rights campaigners as a genocide. Further, the metallic and mineral goods feeding China's Industry 4.0 comes mostly from Africa. In a piece on Tor.com, Tochi Onyebuchi, an American science fiction writer and former civil rights lawyer of Nigerian descent, commented on China's debt colonialism in Africa as further crushing the promise of a sustaining African infrastructure and sea continuity. And so I want to also add that there are discussions to be had that are very necessary about the anti-Black racism against migrant laborers from African nations working in Guangzhou as the Chinese city locked down over COVID-19. And these were well documented on social media. Further, Nadine Munsami authored a paper called Science Fiction Offers a Useful Way to Explore China-Africa Relations. Her research focused on 3 short science fiction stories from Africa, which look at the cultural perspectives of this situation, as indicated by speculative narratives of the China and Africa futures together. So I really would like to see Chinese SF scholarship and authors to work collaboratively in this way across borders and cultures to untangle these events, to reconfigure fairer relationships. And so I return to the title of my presentation on the invisible boundaries and encourage that within this, we are also forefronting the people and the issues that are actively invisibilized by our stories, be they our speculative and science fictions or our day-to-day news. I end by sharing my intentions that when I started the London Chinese Science Fiction Group a year and a half ago, I wanted a space to critically discuss and broaden the insights of our multilingual and international communities. I want to achieve this by not following a canon in the making that slowly embodies and reiterates the hegemonies it can deconstruct. And so I finish with a quote from a fantasy author, Jeanette Ng, whose recent piece responds to the Mulan film. But I actually feel it's very generative in repositioning Chinese SF. In Beyond Authenticity, the Spectre of Han Hegemony, she emphasizes the, and I quote, multitudes contained within Chinese culture and storytelling. There is no single unified Chineseness, and to imply there is one acceptable cultural narrative for all Chinese people is itself part of the problem. To claim sole authority and ownership of these units of cultures reinforces Han hegemony, end quote. As the city of Chengdu bids for Worldcon 2023, one of the biggest dates in the global SF annual calendar, I encourage Chinese SF as a community to recognize and tell necessary world-building stories that defy hegemonies as China calculates its new era of global relations in the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. That was great. Just to pick up on one of the points that you made towards the end about the China-Africa relationship and how you would encourage a kind of exchange between SF communities present in both of those places. How do you think we can kind of constructively work towards that, using the speculative to communicate and ground realities in different cultural spaces or geographies?
Well, I guess whilst we're talking about speculating, a lot of it actually comes from quite grounded research, and authors do kind of speak with other people. And when I kind of had the opportunity last week to ask a few Chinese speculative writers, would you be interested in, co-writing stories with people from different parts of the world, people who actually have very timely and necessary discussions to be had relating to China's geopolitical relationships. And so the authors that I asked, Chen Qufan, Gu Xu, Regina Kanyu Wang, and also Xia Zhao, all together, they said, yeah, we'd love this opportunity because it would create a nuance to the kind of common assumptions that people have of, I guess, the human scale and the human timelines of storytelling this way. But I also think that as we're always kind of like talking across time zones now and across different geographies, that we have more opportunities to hold critical debates online with other people from different countries, from different cultures. Some recent kind of like science fiction conventions that have happened with many panel talks. Last week it was FutureCon. All of the videos are online on YouTube for free to watch. And that was, speculative writers from over 20 countries speaking together on quite critical issues. And then next month in October, there's FireCon, which platforms a lot of Black, Indigenous and people of colour speculative writers. So yeah, I do think it's really possible.
Great. I think it's also interesting. I mean, I want to maybe wish I could be a fly on the wall in some of your meetups of your reading group. Maybe you can tell a little bit, reveal a little bit about that, like what those close readings of those science fiction texts, what kind of conversations that leads to, because I do think that sometimes SF, when it veers into things that are too dystopic, it can kind of almost make you feel apathetic, like, oh yes, this is it causes extreme reactions. Maybe you could just give us some highlight moments from the reading group in terms of particular insights or reactions. I'd be curious to hear.
Oh, it really depends on the mood on the day, to be honest, and how we're all feeling about the world on that particular moment. But no, it's a really reoccurring discussion in SF, actually, in science and speculative fictions, to talk about alternatives to dystopia, especially with our engagements with climate crises and also global health issues. And because it's hard to be optimistic, but when we ground our speculative narratives in a timelining that's different in the sense that these things are always going to happen, they're cyclical crises that really show what our socio-political flaws are, and redirecting our dystopias and maybe pessimisms towards activating towards justice is much more nourishing and useful, and is actually what a lot of speculative writers from non-Western cultures are doing already, or have always been doing. So within the climate change kind of area of science fictions, there's talks of cli-fi, which is like climate sci-fi, which is largely from Western Europe or North America, that has a very kind of like Hollywood apocalyptic storyline that doesn't really speak to the rest of the world, because it's not grounded in a historical understanding that climate change exists because of colonial histories. And those who have been oppressed by these colonial powers have these embedded in the way that we see futures. So that is a difference. And another thing that's been popping up in a recent couple of years is solar punk. Although I am kind of like struggling to find both within cli-fi and solar punk stories or kind of like intentions that are foregrounding speculative writers who are Black, Indigenous and people of colour. Although there is a collection called Sunbolt, co-edited by Phoebe Wagner and a co-editor, that does actually, talk about this quite a lot. So I would recommend that.
Great, thanks. Does anyone from the floor or online have any kind of questions, comments? Would like to ask Angela for a book recommendation, maybe?
Yeah. Now's the time.
Now's the time.
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to come from books as well. You know, works of art, or my own arts practice talks with speculative writing, which I think is a really fun engagement.
Yep.
Yeah, maybe, we have a question, well, I think it's mainly from me actually, is about in your artistic practice, like, because you're mentioning that now, how do you approach the visibility of environmental problems such as materiality and scarcity?
I'm actually working on a project now that is about the water scarcity problem in the UK. And the project itself is called the Moss Rain Paradox. And that comes from the UK government's environmental agency report from June this year. That is actually called the Great British Rain Paradox, which already sounds very dramatic. And this talks about how actually 2,000 people who were surveyed in the UK, 77% of us don't actually believe that the UK will experience a water scarcity problem in the next 25 years, as predictions show. And so I think that to really think about who was actually surveyed, who was what parts of the UK, and kind of like what kinds of uses of water we're talking about is really important, because what I kind of really need to problematize is that the government is focusing on individual family household usages, not corporate ownership or like leisure uses such as golf courses in the UK. And also in the report it talks about population rise being a fundamental problem in water scarcity. But actually, another report that came out only last week was talking about how none of the rivers in the UK passed the regulations. So all of our rivers in the UK are kind of known as polluted. So I think about this a lot in my arts practice, and I'll be making a short film piece that actually interviews the British public again, but to focus on our relationships towards it in a very communal way, talking about our probably like diasporic relationship. Moss as a kind of non-human species character, and focus on its organic technologies. It's used a lot as like an environmental sensor, and I'm very interested in environmental remote sensing as well, and kind of like branch out the understandings of water in our various spaces that are felt. So I'm interested in our bodies and how we experience our changes in environments, and Moss does this really well.
Great, thanks. Curious to see that artwork as it develops. So yeah, it would be wonderful. Does anyone have any? Jarl, do you maybe want to kick off with a question to the whole panel, because we need to now broaden things up.
Yeah.
We're the Q&A is broadening up to everyone, and I think it would be nice to maybe hear your voice a bit.
Yeah, at first, going back to the first two presentations, but it also ties in what Angela said, but maybe on a different level. I was kind of struck by the two colliding kind of developments on either this kind of capital that changes these environments through the material of sand and the logistic of sand, but at the same time also the climate change that is also affecting the landscape. And there you see this very tense relationship, as you were showing, Michaela, between people actually leaving environments because they're are pushed out either through the kind of function of the environment or the radical change of an environment. So they became very kind of tense, radical environments. But interestingly enough, there's a whole new type of species or animals moving into those spaces. And here's what I also thought early on. Benjamin Breton had a presentation where he was describing an old military base that was totally run over by very new types of kind of animals and kind of flowers. Could you reflect a bit on this? Kind of what does these future places look like? And do you know more about other places where these kind of developments occur? Maybe Michaela?
Yeah, I mean, I know the piece you're referring to by Benjamin Breton, and I guess his attempt is to show somehow how humanity gets decentered from the stage, right? Whereas for a long time there was this idea that there is this control and that it's all about the human interest and about the human needs. I guess I also want to unsettle that, but I also want to kind of relocate the human as well into the picture, and maybe also to relate to what was just mentioned by Angela. There has to be a differentiation between the kind of actors we're talking about here and who is responsible for these things happening. And in my presentation, I wanted to show the overlap. Gray spaces that emerge in between, that are not somehow foreseen, but that also should not take away responsibility from those who are in charge, or from those kind of assemblages that make these landscapes become like that. I did not necessarily know about those landscapes before. It's just something that I really also encountered on my research. So when I started to go on that journey and I traveled a few places in Southeast Asia, I happened to encounter those sites, and they did something to the way I perceived the whole situation, and they really left kind of an intense impression on me, and invited me, as I said in the presentation, to somehow rethink my perspective. But I guess it would be an overemphasis to now state that there is something coming after, that it's all made for another species to take over, and we are maybe a medium. Yeah. I think that would also not be correct. But in my narrative, I wanted to see it more as a sign of hope that, despite all these narratives being very totalizing and being very paralyzing as well, what you're just talking about, the climate crisis, crisis of capitalism, that there might be ways to reframe those things. We, I guess, cannot do away with these processes and with the impact they have, but there are ways to maybe emphasize the cracks, and maybe emphasize that which cannot be foreseen, that cannot be known, that is moving beyond the human and beyond the control of the human. And I'm pretty sure there are much more of these landscapes around if you just pay attention to them. At least I hope so.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question also about like accountability, and we've seen also both like multinational and military influences in these spaces. Also within Angela's work, also where we can see these e-waste cities that are also coming from multinationals, Apple. By reading the books and visiting the artworks, do you see also that the audience gets more a peek into the influences of these actors? Because normally these types of things have been disclosed from our view. Do you see that they become aware of the big kind of mechanisms that are embedded in these climate topics? Maybe for Arnold, would you like to comment?
Yes. I just want to connect with our case studies, your question. Unfortunately, these man-made grounds around the Pacific or Indian Ocean are so remote that it's only just few civilians can visit it until now. And I think we are not, that's why they pick up that kind of geographical spaces to not be accessible for a wider audience or a wider public. And I think we are not aware of these places, and they also try to hide it, the history of that places. And just one of the examples, the Johnston Atoll was a huge military base and atomic test site. And after they clean up the surface, they try to reconvert in these days as a natural wild refugee. But this is also a way of not allowing any more people to visit that space. But of course, it's highly toxic today too. And you can see it also this toxicity on the maritime life. Yeah, I don't know if Anca want to contribute with something, but
yeah. I think we're also very good here in the Netherlands of doing that. We can point out many places, and actually there's a work in the exhibition by Tiffin Rice that scans a lot of these dumping grounds, and then they are retransformed into natural environments, and we think it's a nice natural landscape to walk with the dog. But there are very kind of debated places. Yeah, sorry, what you were saying?
Yeah, we call it greenwashing.
Yeah, thank you. Brianne, do we have more questions?
Yeah. We have a question from Nina Hanna to Angela, and they are interested in hearing if Angela has any experience in examining the differences or the overlap between international SF dystopia and indigenous literary responses to colonial and industrial interventions. How would you recommend that we divide and categorize these two separate but similar responses to the world?
So the question is asking that on one hand there are indigenous science fictions that speculate aside from the industrial kind of like types of hard SF maybe?
Yeah, I think Nina's maybe trying to get at the difference between the international science fiction response to dystopia and the indigenous response, and what are the differences and how can we go about seeing the similarities and overlaps.
Yeah, I feel like it's a trouble of publishing and marketing as well. There are a lot of kind of like celebrity names that are in, I guess, like the climate science fictions that are always asked to speak on certain panels about climate knowledges or experiences of using narratives and speculative fictions to think of different ways of the future. And what we need to do is really pass on the microphone to other speakers who have been doing this a lot longer and isn't kind of like jumping onto the trend that now is cli-fi and solar punk, but are doing it with the integrity that is necessary for the actual climate justice work that we hope this way of speculating nurtures. I feel like, it kind of follows on from the previous question about, how much does it really kind of impact people, in the sense that we have a very, a very fine line to tread that is between communicating the issues in a very kind of like humanizing, very fair and accountable way, and one that aestheticizes, one that is steeped in the cultural sector's aims of, gaining profit so that it can keep doing what it does. And so when you kind of like approach different narratives and stories, we kind of also need to be, aware of these frameworks that sell the stories and also sell the, as was mentioned before, the greenwashing tactics that we often see in maybe kind of supposedly mainstream Hollywood style science fictions about climate change. So yeah, I kind of recommend Grace Dillon's anthology, Walking in Clouds, which is an anthology on Indigenous science fiction. I think it's great. And it starts also in mentioning that, you know, some phrases or terms in science fiction have been appropriated from Indigenous knowledges and cultures, and, you know, from Indigenous scholars in science fiction. So these are kind of like things that maybe we don't come across so much as readers or fans of science fiction, but they are there. There are a lot of kind of parallels between the arts and the way that the environmental movement functions. The barriers of white supremacy and patriarchy and neoliberalism are replicated. They exist here. So yeah, it's being mindful of those things.
To just kind of go back to something that's been popping up over the past day and a half, I don't know how to measure anymore.
Weeks.
It's a strange time and space are suspended in our little spaceship in the dark here. But this idea of naturalness and looking at landscape in particular, how it's represented in science fiction or the kind of land reclamation projects Michaela's talking about, some of the material questions coming up from Anca and Arnold. I'm wondering, you know, where the idea of natural comes in and how that's changing over time, because yesterday Teun said, you know, the weeds by the side of the road are also natural, but that's not the picture we get when we, you know, we think of majestic mountains and whatever. Well, okay, maybe in the Netherlands we don't think about mountains, but, you know, trees certainly and things that look beautiful, and trying to see the sort of less glamorous landscapes as also natural. And then, but then there our human impact, of course, on landscapes. So I'm maybe going to throw this to Anca and Arnold to start off. But how does, you know, especially you're finding like evidence of of war in sand. How natural are some of these materials? How do you feel about the idea of naturalness and how it plays out in your work? All of you, but maybe we'll start with you guys, live from Bucharest.
Yeah, as Anca said in the beginning of our presentation, it was one of the ideas that what was the starting point for us to analyze this new perspective, that how landscape become, like how we can turn from noun to verb, you know, that how we make the landscape. We are not just observer, we are creating the landscape itself. And of course, the natural, it's become a man-made, of course. And we are, of course, in the debris sphere concept, we are referring some specific case studies that are very visible. Maybe the Normandy sand is slightly different because there is no physical manifestation, or like too tiny to observe for the first instance, the shift of the natural from the unnatural things. But the rest of the case studies are evident that you can see it as a new land formation around existing landscapes.
Can I comment?
Of course, yeah.
I think it's interesting what also your project shows is that when we think in kind of the nature-culture divide, as I'm sitting here now, this is maybe culture and nature's outside of there. We see now with sand and especially the debris spheres that the particles are reunited again as one material, and there we see that it's not separate anymore. We understand that it's mixed, and that is, so it's retracing your steps. We can learn a lot, I think, about also the nature-culture divide and how to overcome it. And my question as to Angela is like, in Chinese science fiction, how is this divide being discussed, or does it play a role in Chinese science fiction?
Let me think. I mean, this might not be the most relevant example, but what pops into my head is the author of the Waste Tide novel, Chen Shufan. He also wrote a short speculative fiction story on growing a leek on the moon, or growing it in space or something. And it was meant to represent kind of like a longing for home. And this was in the kind of, this was last year when there was the whole, I guess, anniversary of the moon landing, and there was a lot of excitement around space travel again. And I think it's really kind of problematic because, as I showed in a presentation, Ken Liu says, oh, when we go into space, we're all humanity. And no, that's not the case. Most of us are not going to space. Most of us have to deal with this destroyed world that has been exploited and devastated by the colonial powers that still continue through corporations, through spoiled states. And so in that sense, like when stories, not only from China or Hong Kong or Taiwan or anywhere in the world that is kind of, you know, thinking about speculative futures with this nature-culture divide, or maybe romanticizing nature to this extent, is kind of dangerous because it doesn't take into the necessary accountability or integrity that nature is something that is already part of us and integrated with our experience of being human. We're not, you know, as much as we become cyborgian, like we are very much, you know, needing our plants around us.
Thank you. Yeah. Do we have some final maybe questions from the audience?
Yes,
I
we
don't know
have
how
one
we are on
from
time.
Walter.
We have another 8 minutes.
And this question is for Michaela. In the Netherlands, there are speculative design efforts to look at creating new land masses as buffer islands in order to mitigate climate change. I'm wondering if Michaela has any insights into how the Dutch can deal with the ecological change impact on, for instance, the Wadden Sea.
So if I understood correctly, there are attempts to create artificial islands in order to mitigate climate change.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'm a huge, I'm just about to start a huge project in the Netherlands on sand reclamation. So first of all, I'm happy for that question and also for the site being brought up. I didn't know about that initiative. I found that very interesting because it shows a little bit, I guess, the absurdity of those initiatives. Because with land reclamation and with sand mining, you have repercussions also on the way the original land, if you can say that, and also the new land takes into water. So what happens usually is that those mining and reclamation projects, they do have an impact on flooding and on rising sea levels, worsening even those impacts they have. So here we have, I guess, one of those responses that would fall into the category of geoengineering as a response to climate change, right? To somehow strengthen the land that already exists, or to engineer it in such a way that it can maybe mitigate those effects. But it's not really addressing the source of the problem, that is that those practices try to control the environment and to take, nature out there into their systems and to try and calculate the way sand or water behaves within these environments. But this is all based on the assumptions that you can actually foresee and that you can control these. And even though there are a lot of those engineering approaches, especially in the Netherlands, I think most scientists are also very honest about the fact that they do not know the long-term consequences, and that engineering usually only works post the actual engineering, and then it mitigates again and it mitigates again. So the way how those two relate are very problematic, I think. But I will have to do a bit more research on that. Of course, the alternative would be to not do anything at all and to have the coast decompose and have the land crumble into the ocean. And of course, no one wants that either. Other countries do react to that by moving their cities away, like Indonesia, for example, after many years of trying to mitigate against the effects of climate change, they have to move the capital now. So I guess there is no good solution, but I guess being critical towards geoengineering and these attempts and the premise they are based upon is being able to control and to mitigate, which is, I guess, questionable. I will look into that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think interestingly enough, I think about the first session when Teun Karels also told the story of that in the Netherlands we also have a group of scientists and researchers that are thinking of like letting the water in and having to deal with kind of like the moment in time where we might not be able to control it anymore, and maybe it's a time where we could allow it to be. We interact with it in a different way, the environment, and not wait for a moment when it's so critical that we cannot adapt even anymore. So these are very interesting kind of shifts in thinking about kind of engineering and also kind of a relationship with the environment. And I think in the Netherlands it's very, very now that we talk about these issues. So, yeah, great question.
Yep, and I think it's a common theme or thread emerging from the conversations that we're having here is about embracing uncertainty and giving up control. So this is something that keeps coming up in just about every single panel. So that's also a really interesting thing to track across our conference. So with that, I think we should close this session. So thank you to our speakers. And thank you to all of you for joining us. So we're now going to switch to our instability stream again of video art and be back in about 1 hour for our final session, Systems of Support. Thanks very much.